On today's episode of 20 Minutes, we will be talking about gay culture in the 1920s across the United States as well as the Weimar District. We will begin in 1920s Harlem, New York, filled with revolutions of race and queer uprisings. This vibrant city brought forth protests as well as social change. Nightlife in the 1920s was the place for social revolution on an international stage from Paris to Harlem. Queer nightlife thrived in Harlem until Prohibition ended on December 5, 1933. As the 1920s began, the nightlife took place because less Americans felt the need to go out if there is not alcohol being consumed in most nightlife scenes. As the 30s commenced, many LGBTQ plus Americans headed back into the closet or led lives of secrecy in fear of hatred or homophobic actions from stereotypical American society. The Hamilton Lodge was a popular gay nightlife environment in Harlem during the 1920s that flourished and accepted many gay men. Men waited with bated breath to perform on stage with their mandatory wigs resting atop their heads. This event, now known as drag, enabled many LGBTQ plus people to celebrate their true selves and dress according to their own individual gender. According to the New York Age, a newspaper from March 1927, quote, "Wigs were necessary, were in evidence, from the garb of a biblical virgin down to the very sparse attire only seen on burlesque stages of today, accentuated with feminine gesture and lingo, to say nothing of contortions of the hip, formed the makeup of these male masqueraders," end quote. The police did not find it necessary to raid events like these, even though there was a radical nature to these shows and gatherings during the 20s. The time period from 1920 to 33 was known as the pansy craze for LGBTQ plus drag performers, not only in Harlem, but across the world. Popular cities included Greenwich Village and Times Square, held renowned drag performances of the time. Dominant Southern societies, as well as most of America, was largely opposed to LGBTQ plus rights and prosperity at the time, yet balls and masquerades flourished among queer people. Even newspapers had articles or lists of about 20 or 30 of these events that took place every week. According to Gay New York, a book written by historian George Chauncey, quote, "This was not supposed to exist. It's not that they were visible, but that popular culture and newspapers at the time remarked on their visibility. Everyone knew that they were visible," end quote. Newspapers were by far the biggest promotion of queer visibility in the 1920s. U.S. culture and Black newspapers such as the Pittsburgh Courier and Baltimore African American had articles about the LGBTQ plus movement and drag balls on the front pages of papers. Balls took place at iconic places such as Madison Square Garden and Rockland Palace in Harlem.
Harlem was the quintessential capital for racial and queer rights movements in the U.S., but as we look outward onto an international stage, the Weimar District stands out for queer progress before the rise of Nazism in World War II. The Weimar District arguably witnessed the first revolution of gay rights and progress in documented human culture. Magnus Hirschfeld, a sexologist, as many of us have learned, led and championed gay rights in Berlin through the lens of science with evidence-based procedure. In the 1930s, he began a world tour to try to spread his education of sex and sexuality past the Weimar District, yet his Jewish identity during the rise of Nazi power ended this tour. All the LGBTQ plus history seems to be lost in time, even though there are books, art, and evidence of this revolution and fight for equality. The Nazi rise to power stopped the unprecedented progress for sexuality and gay rights that was created. While this time was historic for gay rights, subgroups were marginalized and homophobia still existed. According to Kate Sutton, quote, "Street prostitutes, upper-class bohemians, and working-class barflies were all marginalized and told to hang out in, quote, disorderly spaces, also known as bars, whereas other LGBTQ plus members were told through the media to frequent respectable bars and clubs. Trans people of the time worked to get public acknowledgement of their identities. Trans people wanted to be respected, yet most felt they must put on a performative appearance in public spaces, whereas at home they could dress and be whoever they wanted. Even with the rise of this extraordinary movement for gay progress in Germany, there was still homophobia to marginalized groups within the LGBTQ plus community. Today, in U.S. culture and internationally, we see more acceptance for gay people, yet still homophobia and hate crimes against trans people have increased. those who do not fit the binary gender they were born into are marginalized and treated with less respect. In general, we see less support for subgroups of the community. While Germany and Harlem had growing support in the 1920s for gay rights, there is still a stereotype in Western cultures that outlasts time, which is that gay people are different and othered in society, even seen and treated as lesser than. In Native American culture, the idea of being gay is presented not as other, but equal to those who define themselves as straight in society. While Native American people have been treated horribly, marginalized, and deemed lesser by Western society in the past centuries, the idea of Two-Spirit people has been a light of progress. Two-Spirit, as of 2017, is considered a subgroup of the LGBTQ plus culture, but it does not mean that someone is simply gay and Native American. Two-spirited people can be male, female, and intersex who don't identify by the laws of binary gender. They can do activities and act as though they are the opposite gender or somewhere in between. For example, a woman dressed in men's clothes would be an example of how two-spirited people are perceived in Native American culture. This status amounted them to a third and more spiritual gender. Specific indigenous communities have specific names for people who define themselves as two-spirit. According to Indian Health Services, quote, over 500 surviving Native American cultures' attitudes about sex and gender can be very diverse. Even with the modern adoption of pan-Indian terms like Two-Spirit, not all cultures will perceive Two-Spirit people the same way or welcome a pan-Indian term to replace the terms already in use by their cultures, end quote. Two-spirited people differ from group to group, yet the glory and respect they receive is unlike any other culture to this day. According to HRC, quote, the most prominent accounts colonial white men note seeing men married to men whom they call Berdashe and passing women, who were assigned female at birth but took on masculine roles, end quote. Colonial men, as they were literally colonizing Native Americans, took on documentation of homophobic language, yet the beauty of two-spirit people continued. According to HRC, research shows that over 150 Native American cultures respect and note that they believe there's a third gender, but by no means did every single Native American culture accept that notion. The Oshtisk from the Crow Nation, as an example, believed that, quote, it is not only acceptable for one to be bait, also known as two-spirit, but they were often regarded highly as being the bridge between the two genders, end quote. Here, those who define themselves as bait are considered higher in society and well-respected, unlike Western cultures that have dominated land, committed racist acts, and killed many Native Americans. Ironic, right? We learn about how society has mistreated the LGBTQ plus community, such as Germany and Harlem, yet how these groups persisted and thrived for periods in the 20s. Why has two-spirited people been left out of the picture? The influence and prejudice from Western culture introduced the foreign concept of homophobia, which tainted what had been a sacred tradition in most Native American cultures. Contemporary interest in two-spirited people came to light prior to the modern gay rights movement and has been studied as a, quote, new phenomenon succeeded by generations. The fact that homophobia had to be introduced to Native American culture is disgusting and proves Western influence in the first place. I hope with knowledge gained from today's episode, one will not only be able to accept those who belong to the LGBTQ plus community, but celebrate, appreciate, and treat them with equality.